The organization functioned on precision, not the visible precision of deadlines or polished presentations, but the quiet precision of influence. Who spoke first, who concluded, who remained silent long enough to alter the temperature of a room. Titles existed, but hierarchy lived in subtler arrangements. At the top sat an executive whose authority had never required defense. Years of disciplined outcomes had secured that position. Strategy passed through his office before it reached any formal platform. Language was refined there. Risk was filtered there. Ambition was calibrated there. Nothing advanced without his awareness. He did not demand control. He embodied it. Beneath him operated a senior advisor responsible for internal diagnostics, performance reviews, cultural assessments, risk modeling. The role was structured as supportive, observational, analytical. The advisor produced reports that informed executive direction but did not shape it publicly. Access defined the difference. The executive possessed unmediated access to the board. The advisor possessed access to information. Information without direct authority remains contained. For years, the dynamic remained stable. Reports were delivered with precision. The executive absorbed their insights, extracted what aligned with broader narrative, and positioned it strategically during board discussions. The advisor never contested interpretation. He observed. Over time, his observations deepened. Patterns emerged beneath performance metrics. Not inefficiencies. Those were minor and correctable, but behavioral hesitations. Department leaders delayed proposals by days, sometimes weeks, even when urgency was evident. The delays were not procedural. They were psychological. Interviews conducted during internal audits revealed a recurring undertone: uncertainty about reception. Leaders were unclear which ideas would be endorsed and which would be quietly redirected. The executive's expectations were exacting, but not always explicit. The organization valued excellence. It also feared misalignment. The advisor compiled findings carefully. He did not dramatize them. He framed them as latency risks, minor hesitation points that could compound over time. When he presented the analysis, the executive listened without interruption. Silence extended beyond the final slide. The executive's response was measured. He acknowledged the data. He questioned methodology. He requested longitudinal comparison. No defensiveness surfaced. Yet the atmosphere cooled. The advisor recognized the inflection. His role required accuracy, not comfort. He provided additional documentation, correlation models, and comparative benchmarks. The executive absorbed them all. In subsequent weeks, subtle adjustments occurred. The executive began articulating expectations more explicitly in meetings. He clarified criteria for proposal evaluation. He encouraged calculated risk within defined boundaries. Performance metrics improved marginally, but hesitation did not disappear. The advisor noticed another pattern. In closed interviews, department heads expressed a consistent tension. They sought strategic alignment before presenting ideas, yet they lacked informal access to test alignment safely. Meetings with the executive were high stakes. Every interaction felt consequential. The executive's composure, once a source of stability, had become a source of distance. The advisor faced a structural dilemma. Reporting this perception risked implying leadership detachment. Withholding it risked allowing latent friction to grow. He chose to report. Again, the executive listened. Again, silence followed. This time, the executive reframed the issue. He described the organization's high-performance culture as intentionally demanding. Discomfort, he suggested, sharpened preparation. The advisor did not argue. He understood that authority rarely accepts reinterpretation immediately. Instead, he expanded his observational lens. He began mapping informal communication networks, who consulted whom before submitting proposals. The patterns were revealing. A small cluster of mid-level managers had become unofficial sounding boards. Ideas circulated laterally before ever approaching the executive layer. Alignment was being constructed outside formal channels. not in defiance. In self-protection, the advisor presented this mapping as structural resilience, evidence that the organization was compensating for perceived risk. The executive studied the network diagrams carefully. For the first time, he asked fewer methodological questions. He asked about long-term implications. The advisor responded with measured clarity. Lateral networks increase adaptive capacity but may gradually redistribute influence. Over time, informal centers of validation can rival formal authority. The statement hung between them. The executive did not dismiss it. He shifted inquiry. "How visible is this shift?" he asked. The advisor answered precisely. "Not yet visible to the board. Not yet measurable in performance variance. But perceptible within internal dynamics." Visibility defines urgency. The executive did not intervene publicly. Instead, he initiated a series of small group strategic dialogues with department heads. Invitations were selective. Tone was conversational rather than evaluative. Attendance was high. Participants reported feeling newly included. Yet the advisor observed something else. Those invited to dialogues began consolidating influence within their divisions. Access to the executive, even in informal settings, elevated status. Other leaders noticed. Hierarchy recalibrated quietly. The advisor documented the shift, but hesitated to report it immediately. The executive's intervention had reduced surface hesitation, but introduced asymmetry. Proximity was becoming currency. Over months, the imbalance deepened. Department heads without direct access began routing proposals through those who possessed it. Informal gatekeeping emerged. The lateral network contracted into clusters aligned with executive proximity. Information still flowed to the advisor. He saw the contraction clearly. He scheduled a review. This time, he presented data without interpretation. Graphs illustrating concentration of proposal sponsorship, response times segmented by access tier, sentiment analysis from internal surveys. The executive leaned back, studying the material in silence. The data suggested that perceived inclusion had unintentionally centralized influence further, not distributed it. The executive spoke slowly. "What is the risk trajectory?" The advisor answered without embellishment. "Overconcentration increases fragility. If access narrows to select intermediaries, decision diversity declines. Organizational confidence becomes dependent on relational positioning rather than merit." The executive absorbed the assessment. He did not defend his strategy, but his next action revealed calculation. He restructured meeting protocols. Proposal submissions would now bypass informal sponsorship and enter a standardized review system before executive exposure. Access would be procedural, not relational. On paper, the change democratized opportunity. In practice, it removed the intermediaries who had gained proximity. Tension surfaced subtly. Some department heads experienced loss of informal advantage. Others felt cautious relief. The advisor monitored adaptation curves. Submission volume increased initially, then stabilized. Review cycles lengthened slightly due to standardized filtering. Executive time became more protected, yet a new form of hesitation appeared. Proposals grew more conservative. Without relational calibration, leaders defaulted to safer options. Innovation narrowed. The advisor prepared another analysis. He recognized the pattern now. Every structural adjustment designed to stabilize authority was producing secondary effects. Each correction introduced a new layer of imbalance. He presented findings again. The executive's composure remained intact. But this time, his silence carried different weight. Not dismissal, not resistance, but calculation tinged with recognition. Authority had become reactive. The dust of doubt, once microscopic, now floated visibly in internal air. Not open dissent, not rebellion. Uncertainty. Uncertainty about how to approach power. The advisor understood that doubt, once introduced into hierarchy, does not evaporate through procedure. It settles into behavior. It shapes anticipation. He concluded the report with a restrained observation. When leaders optimize for control, organizations optimize for safety. The executive did not respond immediately. He dismissed the meeting with minimal commentary. In the weeks that followed, he reduced unscheduled interactions. He relied heavily on dashboards, metrics, filtered reports. Direct dialogue decreased. The advisor continued observing. Informal networks began re-expanding, but this time outside visibility entirely. Conversations shifted off formal channels. Alignment occurred privately before documentation. The executive's authority remained unquestioned publicly. Yet privately, leaders began asking one another a different question before advancing ideas. Is this worth the exposure? The dust of doubt had settled, not dramatically, not loudly, but evenly across the structure. And once settled, it altered how every movement occurred within it. Doubt rarely announces itself. It accumulates in margins, between intention and interpretation, between instruction and initiative. Once present, it alters posture before it alters performance. The executive sensed it, though no formal indicator confirmed its scale. Performance remained within acceptable range. Revenue targets held. Attrition was stable. No crisis demanded visible correction. Yet the atmosphere inside strategic meetings had shifted. Participants prepared more thoroughly, but spoke less freely. Questions were framed defensively. Risk assessments extended longer than necessary. Proposals arrived structurally sound, yet conceptually restrained. The organization was becoming efficient at avoidance. The advisor continued his quiet surveillance of internal dynamics. Survey language had become more cautious. Leaders described the culture as precise, disciplined, and highly accountable. Few used the word confident. Confidence is audible even when unspoken. Its absence is measurable. The executive initiated compression, not through confrontation, but through structure. He believed doubt required clarity, not accommodation. Ambiguity, in his view, was the breeding ground for hesitation. He introduced a strategic alignment index, a formal scoring mechanism evaluating proposals before executive review. Criteria were explicit: alignment to long-term vision, quantified risk exposure, resource efficiency, reputational impact. The index appeared neutral. It was not. It shifted the burden of interpretation downward. Department heads now had to self-evaluate against an executive-defined matrix before submission. Scores accompanied proposals. The change reduced executive filtering time. It also intensified internal pressure. Leaders began calibrating their own assessments conservatively. No one wanted to appear overconfident. Scores clustered in mid-range bands, rarely exceeding 85 out of 100. The executive noticed the clustering. He interpreted it as modesty or caution. The advisor interpreted it differently. He mapped the variance over time. As the index institutionalized, proposal diversity narrowed further. Experimental initiatives disappeared entirely. Leaders optimized for predictable approval. Compression had begun. The executive, observing increased procedural discipline, believed he was restoring clarity. Meetings shortened. Fewer revisions were required. Board presentations were sharper, but innovation metrics declined subtly. The advisor presented the trend during a quarterly review. No accusation, no dramatization, just comparative data. Exploratory projects down 37 over 2 quarters. Cross-functional initiatives reduced by 22. The executive examined the figures without visible reaction. He asked a single question: correlation or causation? The advisor responded precisely. Correlation strongly aligned with introduction of the Strategic Alignment Index and standardized submission protocol. Silence followed. The executive did not rescind the index. Instead, he refined it. He added a category labeled Strategic Initiative Weight, encouraging proposals that stretched beyond incremental improvement. The scoring system now rewarded ambition on paper, but psychological residue remained. Leaders did not trust the reward mechanism. They remembered earlier redirections, earlier cooling silences. Ambition requires safety. Safety had been proceduralized, not internalized. Compression intensified through visibility. The executive began holding public review sessions where selected proposals were dissected openly, not to humiliate, but to refine. He framed the sessions as educational forums. Participation was mandatory for senior leaders. The sessions were controlled, analytical, devoid of theatrics. Feedback was sharp but measured. Flaws were identified methodically. No voice was raised. No personal criticism delivered. Yet observation replaced dialogue. Leaders began studying one another's evaluations, absorbing microsignals from the executive's tone, from pauses, from which slides drew extended scrutiny. Learning occurred. So did caution. After several cycles, proposal submissions declined again. Those presented in public sessions were increasingly risk-neutral. Improvements to existing systems, efficiency enhancements, compliance upgrades. The advisor documented the pattern privately. He recognized that compression was no longer structural. It was cultural. The executive sought to eliminate doubt by tightening criteria. Instead, doubt had embedded deeper, adapting to each refinement. A new behavior emerged. Before drafting proposals, department heads began conducting informal risk audits among peers, quiet conversations testing how ideas might be perceived by the executive. These discussions occurred outside formal channels, often off calendar. Alignment was being reconstructed laterally again, but this time with more sophistication. The advisor detected the resurgence through communication mapping. Email clusters revealed pre-submission consultation networks expanding. The executive's visibility into early-stage thinking was diminishing. He reported this carefully. The executive listened. He understood the pattern now. Every attempt to formalize clarity generated shadow alignment elsewhere. Authority, when over-optimized, pushes initiative underground. He initiated a different tactic. Rather than increasing scrutiny, he reduced it publicly. He began approving select proposals with minimal modification. He praised calculated risk in board sessions. He referenced the need for adaptive experimentation in volatile markets. His language shifted subtly from precision to resilience. The change unsettled some leaders. Consistency had been their anchor. Now unpredictability returned, though in softer form. The advisor monitored sentiment closely. Initial reactions were cautious optimism. Some leaders tested minor boundary expansions. A few proposals regained exploratory edge. But something fundamental had shifted during compression. Leaders no longer assessed ideas solely on strategic merit. They assessed them on executive mood trajectory, trying to anticipate whether this phase favored caution or boldness. The dust of doubt had transformed into strategic anticipation. The executive noticed the oscillation. He realized that authority interpreted through mood rather than principle creates instability. He had not intended to become variable. He had intended to become precise. Precision had been interpreted as volatility. The insight arrived without drama. During a closed session with the advisor, he asked directly, "At what point does control begin eroding trust rather than reinforcing it?" The advisor did not answer immediately. He reviewed months of data mentally, hesitation indices, innovation metrics, engagement scores. "Control," he replied carefully, "erodes trust when response patterns become difficult to model." The executive absorbed the phrasing. Difficult to model. Predictability is a form of safety. He had believed consistency in standards equaled predictability. But leaders experienced something different. Unpredictability in emotional response, in microsignals, in approval tone. Compression had not been structural alone. It had been atmospheric. The executive recalibrated once more. He discontinued public dissection sessions. He replaced them with smaller advisory consultations, confidential, exploratory, non-evaluative. Participation rotated deliberately to prevent proximity concentration. He instructed explicitly that early-stage thinking would not be scored. The strategic alignment index remained, but only for final submissions. Gradually, exploratory conversations resurfaced. Tentative ideas returned to meeting rooms, though still cautiously. The advisor observed incremental recovery in proposal diversity. Not dramatic, not immediate, but measurable. Yet compression had left residue. Some leaders who had thrived under relational proximity earlier now felt uncertain in the new rotating access model. Influence equalized superficially but lacked warmth. Trust was rebuilding structurally, not emotionally. The executive sensed the limitation. Authority repositioning now required restraint rather than refinement. He reduced commentary frequency in meetings. He allowed silence to sit without filling it. He deferred to peer discussion before offering synthesis. The shift was subtle. Participants began speaking more fully before executive consolidation. Dialogue lengthened organically. The dust did not vanish, but it settled differently, less dense, more dispersed. Still, a final pressure point remained. The board, observing fluctuations in innovation metrics over the year, requested a cultural resilience audit. They sought confirmation that leadership dynamics were not constraining growth. The audit would include confidential interviews beyond executive oversight. The executive approved without resistance. He understood the implications. Compression had drawn attention. Now external evaluation would test whether repositioning had been sufficient. The advisor was appointed liaison to the auditors. Data would surface unfiltered. The next phase would determine whether authority had recalibrated or merely shifted shape. External evaluation alters internal gravity. When the board commissioned the cultural resilience audit, it did not frame the request as corrective. It framed it as prudent oversight. Growth phases, they suggested, required recalibration of leadership dynamics. The executive accepted the premise without objection. Publicly, the organization interpreted the audit as routine governance. Privately, senior leaders understood its significance. Confidential interviews would capture sentiment beyond procedural metrics. Perception would surface without filtration. The advisor coordinated logistics, but did not influence substance. Interview frameworks were standardized. Participation lists were randomized. Responses would be anonymized before synthesis. For the first time in years, the executive would encounter narrative not curated by hierarchy. The audit unfolded quietly over 6 weeks. Meetings continued. Metrics held steady. No visible disruption occurred. Yet a layer of tension ran beneath operational rhythm. Not panic, not resistance, but anticipation. When the final report arrived, it was concise. Performance alignment remained strong. Strategic clarity was widely acknowledged. Respect for executive competence was consistent. But one theme repeated across interviews: emotional distance. Leaders described the executive as precise, disciplined, and formidable. They also described uncertainty about psychological accessibility. They felt evaluated even in informal settings. They described calibrating language carefully in his presence. No accusation of hostility appeared, only guardedness. The report concluded with a restrained observation. Sustained high-performance environments require not only structural clarity, but relational predictability. The executive read the report alone. No visible reaction followed. He scheduled a private session with the advisor. There was no defensiveness in his tone. "Is this new?" he asked. The advisor considered carefully. "The language is new. The pattern is not." Silence extended between them. The executive had believed that compression had restored clarity. Instead, it had revealed something deeper. The dust of doubt had not been about policy. It had been about proximity. Authority, when held tightly for too long, can create an invisible perimeter. Even when doors are open, few cross thresholds freely. The executive did not attempt immediate correction. Instead, he made a single structural decision. He transferred oversight of early-stage strategic incubation to a newly formalized Strategic Development Council, comprised of rotating department heads, chaired not by him, but by the advisor. The council would review exploratory initiatives before executive exposure. Its mandate: encourage conceptual expansion without immediate evaluation pressure. The executive retained final approval rights. But first exposure shifted. The announcement was framed as innovation acceleration. The board approved. Departments responded with cautious optimism. The advisor understood the weight of the transfer. It was not delegation of authority over final decisions. It was delegation of first contact. First contact shapes psychological climate. Within the council, dialogue differed from prior executive sessions. Discussions were rigorous but exploratory. Ideas were stress-tested without hierarchical gaze. Critique focused on refinement rather than defensibility. Proposal diversity increased within weeks. The advisor curated submissions to the executive carefully, presenting not only polished initiatives, but context behind their evolution. He framed risks transparently, linking them to long-term positioning. When the executive reviewed council-endorsed proposals, his posture shifted. He was no longer first evaluator. He was final integrator. The change altered interaction patterns. Department heads began engaging more fluidly within council settings. Psychological rehearsal occurred there. By the time ideas reached executive review, their sponsors were steadier. The executive observed the improvement. Meetings grew more substantive. Defensive language decreased. Leaders spoke in forward terms rather than precautionary disclaimers. The dust began to lift, not because authority weakened, because authority repositioned. Months passed. Innovation metrics rebounded. Cross-functional initiatives increased. Employee engagement surveys reflected moderate gains in perceived psychological safety. The board noted the trend positively, yet the most significant shift was less measurable. In one executive session reviewing a high-risk expansion proposal, a department head disagreed openly with a refinement suggestion offered by the executive. The disagreement was articulated calmly, supported by data. The room did not freeze. The executive paused. He examined the counterpoint without visible irritation. Then he adjusted his position. "Proceed with the revised projection," he said. The moment passed without ceremony, but those present recognized its weight. Open disagreement had occurred without relational fracture. Authority had absorbed challenge without tightening. After the meeting, no congratulatory conversations followed. No one dramatized the exchange. Yet internal posture changed. Leaders recalibrated expectations. Evaluation no longer equaled exposure. Over time, informal networks diminished not because they were suppressed, but because they were no longer necessary for psychological protection. Alignment occurred through council dialogue rather than shadow consultation. The executive continued focusing on external positioning, but he reintroduced select informal interactions, unscripted check-ins, shorter meetings without formal agenda. His tone remained composed, but pauses softened. He did not attempt warmth theatrically. He reduced distance strategically. The advisor watched carefully. He understood that irreversibility was not about who controlled decisions. It was about how authority was experienced. One final structural evolution occurred quietly. During annual governance revision, the board formalized the Strategic Development Council as permanent body. Its charter included independent reporting authority. Recommendations would be logged alongside executive commentary in board minutes. Not as oversight, as transparency. The executive endorsed the charter without amendment. From that point forward, strategic proposals carried dual notation: council endorsement and executive integration. Hierarchy remained intact, but authority was no longer solitary in origin. It was layered. The dust of doubt did not vanish entirely. No organization functions without tension, but its density reduced. It no longer settled automatically before every interaction. The executive retained decisive power. He also relinquished psychological monopoly. The advisor's role evolved from observer to architect of dialogue. He did not accumulate visible authority. He shaped environment instead. Years later, performance charts would show gradual improvement across innovation indices and leadership confidence scores. No dramatic turnaround occurred. No public transformation narrative was crafted. Only incremental recalibration. In private reflection, the executive understood that doubt had never been directed at his competence. It had been a response to proximity asymmetry. When authority sits too high, even excellence feels distant. He did not regret compression. It had revealed structural fragility. But he recognized that control must sometimes redistribute to preserve itself. Meetings settled into steady cadence. Silences no longer signaled caution. They signaled thought. The dust had shifted, not eliminated, integrated. And in that integration, authority became less brittle, more permanent. The shift was complete. Irreversible not because power changed hands, but because power changed form.